Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show we ask the question, which victim of extremism will Britain remember, Lee Rigby or Mohammed Salim?
The shocking killing of Lee Rigby earlier this year by people believing themselves to be Muslims was predictably followed by weeks of media coverage. Although such extremism is contradictory to Islam, Muslims felt it necessary to again denounce it. However, there was another victim of extremism shortly after, 82-year-old Mohammed Salim. He was stabbed 3 times until he died on his way home from prayers. The extremist here was Ukrainian student Pavlo Lapshin, a man who also bombed several mosques in Britain. For this killing, the British media was comparably quiet. Was it because his beliefs were not expressed as being Islamic? Today's Islam and Life asks, which victim of extremism will Britain remember? Lee Rigby or Mohammed Salim?
That's an important question for all of us when we live in the West, in European societies, in Britain, and we see how media are covering all the stories, and when it comes to extremism, connecting extremism to Islam and Muslims, and covering everything which is connected to this in a way which is shedding some suspicion about all the Muslims. So much so that today, when we have a practicing Muslim, it's a potential extremist, and this picture is not coming from nowhere. It's coming from politicians, it's coming from intellectuals, but it's also coming from the media. And the coverage, it's for free media, it's a coverage that is not so balanced, and a lack of equality when it comes to dealing with citizens. So we have 2 examples here. Lee Rigby on the one side, where this was a huge again, coverage about Islamic extremism, or the so-called Islamic extremists. On the other side, what we had is not talking too much about people who are victims. And this is happening in Britain, but it's happening also on the global scale, when we have Arabs and Asian people being killed as if they have less value than Western people when it comes to military occupation. So what we are experiencing in Britain, we are experiencing throughout the world. And this is a very important question. How can we deal with this? How can we explain this? Which kind of new racism against Muslims and Islamophobia? What are the questions that should be asked to the media today to get something which is a more equitable coverage and a sense of responsibility coming from the journalists? And to answer all these questions, I'm joined by my guest, journalist and editor of 5pillars.com, Rashan Mohammed Saleh. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me start with this story, and in which way this story reveals something about the way the media are working in Britain, but not only in Britain. It's a fact that it's a phenomenon that we find everywhere throughout the West. It's the same in the United States of America. We can find the same in Australia. So there is something which is that we can take as an example, a case study here in Britain that is happening everywhere, and it reveals something. So how would you tackle this issue?
There was some coverage of the Mohammed Salim murder, but very small coverage, lasted for a day or 2. And when his killer was convicted, that lasted for a day or 2 as well. But there was constant coverage, of course, of the Woolwich murders, lasting several months. Obviously that led to a backlash against Muslims. Literally, mosques were firebombed. Muslim women especially were attacked on the streets. But the killer of Mohammed Salim was never called a terrorist in the newspapers, whereas what he did was probably be classified as terrorism, whereas the killers of Lee Rigby were called terrorists every single day, and they probably were, but there has to be some equity here. So I think the lesson is obviously the life of a white non-Muslim soldier is worth more than the life of a brown elderly Muslim in the eyes of the British media.
Let me ask you a question here. If you have to think about the reasons why this is happening, is it because of the owner of the media? Is it because the relationship between the media and power? Or is it because of the victims? What are the reasons explaining what is happening?
Well, I think there is a close relationship between the government, politics and power and the media. I mean, obviously on the face of it, they are supposed to be separate entities, but in reality, the reality is much more complicated, much more grey than that. And what you have in this country is you have an establishment media, which is quite obviously Islamophobic, a right-wing media owned by Rupert Murdoch and media moguls like that, the Daily Mail, the Star, the Times, the Sun, quite obviously carrying Islamophobic headlines, promoting hatred of Muslims, not always in a blatant way, but in a subtle way. Obviously, at the moment, they're promoting hatred of women that wear the burqa, for example, and presenting them as a terrorist threat, etc. So every Muslim is under potential suspicion of being a terrorist. But you also have the left-wing media in this country, which occasionally will support Muslims and is not perceived as Islamophobic. But I would argue that they are also Islamophobic, but in a more subtle way, because ultimately they are also members of the establishment. So, now kind of Muslims, hatred against Muslims is acceptable. It's almost mainstream in this society. And people don't even classify it as hate in the same way that they would classify racism as hate.
Let me try to clarify this picture, because it's quite heavy when you say, for example, Times and the Sun. On the other side, we have, leftist newspapers or TV programs that could be perceived as, you are using the term Islamophobia. Meaning there is something here which has to do with stigmatization of Muslims, or pure plain racism towards or against the Muslims, or even more. And you will, if you want, you can define what you mean by Islamophobia. But what or who is Islamophobic? Are the newspapers, the journalists? If you see the journalists, are they promoting something which is an ideology that they are promoting? Because it's very difficult if you see journalists, and very often through the whole spectrum of journalists today in Britain, you can't just say you are working for an Islamophobic newspaper. How would you clarify this? I mean,
obviously I'm generalizing, and obviously there are lots of exceptions to the rule. There are lots of fine journalists working for The Guardian, even The Times, but they really are kind of pebbles in an ocean. It's like throwing pebbles in an ocean, quite frankly. I mean, Seamus Milne, for example, who works for The Guardian, wonderful journalist, always coming out with pro-Muslim stuff, but ultimately, in a way, you could argue that he might be giving legitimacy to an Islamophobic institution. I mean, I'm talking at a very kind of, perhaps too much of an intellectual level. I don't want to get too deep into it. But I would argue that, yes, The Guardian is ultimately an Islamophobic newspaper, but on a much more subtle...
What does it mean?
Well, in that it's promoting certain stereotypes against Muslims in its coverage.
And what is the reason? Is because it's an ideology that is...
Yes, I mean, I think when you look at newspapers like The Sun and The Times, you can look at their owner, Rupert Murdoch, who ultimately is a right-wing media mogul, promoting capitalism, promoting imperialism, if you like, and you can look at the owner and see his reflection in the newspaper itself. In The Guardian, I don't think the editors of The Guardian or The Independent could be termed as Islamophobic in any way, but nevertheless they reflect that they are still mainstream British newspapers, and they reflect certain Islamophobic attitudes that pass the dinner test in mainstream society. And ultimately the newspaper industry is very badly regulated. They can basically say what they want, whereas the TV industry in this country is quite well regulated, but nevertheless TV journalists are quite lazy, and they take the newspapers set the agenda, and whatever agenda they set, the TV journalists pick up on that. So really the influence of the press in this country is very strong, and it permeates throughout the rest of the audiovisual media.
Mm-hmm. So if you talk to some people and some journalists, the first reaction, listening to you and listening to some leaders and Muslims, not only here but around the world, say, you know what, you play the victim mentality. You are, so the perception is you play the victims, and this is a mindset that you have to reform.
Yes.
I want you to respond to this. You say, okay, look, what are the reasons? And it's as if, you know, when we speak about Islam, you are always complaining about the media targeting the Muslims.
Well, I think there is some truth in that. I think Muslims do play the victim, and perhaps they're too comfortable in this kind of victim mode. Maybe even they like it a little bit, and it's their comfort zone. And I think it is...
What is the difference with your position right now? Because someone listening to you could say, look, you are playing the victim.
No, I mean, Islamophobia exists. There's no doubt about it, and we have to...
No, but the way you are putting it with the media, how would you explain this and defend your position?
Well, I don't think I need to defend. You see, this is the problem: is Muslims are always defending all the time. I don't want to go on TV and defend the fact that I'm a Muslim and be always on the defensive. You know, why can't I be on the offensive? This is the problem with Muslims when they go on TV. They're always apologizing for Islam indirectly, or they're apologizing for being Muslims indirectly. I make no apologies. Okay, and I think the non-Muslims in this country, they are the majority, and it's incumbent on them to take care of the minorities. You know, it's always incumbent on the majority to look after minorities. That is a sign of a civilized society. So while I do think Muslims need to be more proactive and certainly come across on TV better than they do and not apologize all the time, I mean, I think one of the mistakes they made after the Lee Rigby murder is that they were apologizing for it as if it had anything to do with Islam. And the very fact that they went on TV and they were saying this has nothing to do with Islam meant that people automatically associated Islam with that murder. So it would be much better for Muslims to say, look, I'm not going to answer any questions on this. It has nothing to do with me. And journalists are lazy. They want a story. If you don't give them the story, they won't run with it.
Okay, so to be proactive, to be assertive on some of the positions, yet the question here is, which type of journalists do you want? Because you mentioned Shima Asmalnes just before from The Guardian. Shima, you know, when you were talking about he's pro-Muslim. So is it the opposite of Islamophobia? Journalists that are promoting or helping or showing a kind of, you know, connection with Islam? Or don't we have to say it's not this or that? What we need in this country, what we need everywhere, is more objective journalists when it comes, and when you were talking about equity. So very often in the mindset of some of Muslims, very often the opposite of a bad journalist is a journalist that is supporting us. So is this the right answer?
Well, I think that you know, Muslims ultimately need to follow a two-pronged policy. One is to get into the mainstream media. That is where the power still lies at the moment, even though that it's becoming fragmented, and I personally think that social media is the future. But Muslims do need to get into the mainstream media, to have influence within the mainstream media. And the problem at the moment is that the Muslims that are getting into the mainstream media tend to be more mainstream than non-Muslims. And therefore they're not really reflecting their community or even representing their community, apart from perhaps having a brown face on TV, which I personally don't see that adds much value. On the other hand, Muslims have to have their own institutions, but those institutions need to be of a certain quality and a certain professionalism. At the moment they're not. They tend to be in the hands of special interest groups which plug a certain agenda, a certain type of Islam. So Muslims, you know, they have been pursuing that policy for a while now, but they just haven't been doing it very well. So what I want to see is I want to see Muslims in the mainstream media, but, you know, practicing Muslims that are confident of their identity, that don't always think, you know, am I pleasing the non-Muslims all the time, but also who make a positive contribution to society. Because we're a minority here, but ultimately we have a duty to British society, not just Muslims, but non-Muslims as well. well. But I also want to see Muslim media being far more professional than it actually is at the moment.
Okay, so that's a fair point. Let me ask you something. You said something which is important in that field. We know that there is a lack of equity when it comes to covering events and when it comes to Muslims and when it comes and this generalization, essentialization of Islam and Muslims, potential terrorists and terrorists. We know that. And now what you are saying is that you are expecting journalists and Muslims within that field as journalists to be involved in the mainstream, not only to be on the margin, to be in the mainstream, and then they can also add other, their own, way of dealing with the media, TV programs or channels or newspapers. And you said something which is the added value. I want you to tell me which is this added value? How is this going to be translated? The added value of Muslims in the media when we have these problems, this state of affairs, how do you translate this into reality?
I just think that at the grassroots level, and I deal more with the grassroots than people in positions of power. And I prefer it that way, quite frankly. Because the people in positions of power, they already have their own platforms. At the grassroots level, Muslims watch other Muslims on TV who are quite prominent, and they don't see a mirror of themselves. They see a mirror of the establishment. They see Muslims who are apologizing, or they would term apologizing for Islam, for being Muslim, nearly, and who are very concerned about what the powers will be. They'll kind of monitor their words and what they'll think, and they're trying to please the establishment rather than the grassroots. And I would like to see Muslims on TV in prominent positions really reflecting the grassroots of their own community. And I think if they do that, then ultimately the community itself will be more supportive of them.
So the point is the way you look at the reality, so to cover much more the ordinary people than the real life. So this is one thing.
They're out of touch. I mean, Muslim leaders in this country are completely out of touch. They're in their ivory towers, and they're kind of they mix with a certain narrow group of people, and they don't get into the heartlands of their own communities. And you can see it on social media a lot. They really are out of touch. I mean, there was a certain prominent Muslim personality. I won't mention him because I don't want to embarrass him, but he went on TV a few days ago on a very high-profile political program, and he was absolutely slaughtered by the interviewer. He had no idea what to say, and he was on the defensive throughout. And really, our leaders are doing a poor job of presenting the Muslim community in this country.
So we also have to think about who is going and how we go to the media and talk, because it's not only a question of journalists, it's also a question of leadership. And it's quite clear that we have a problem with the leadership.
We have terrible leaders. We do.
Sorry?
We have very bad leaders in this country, yes.
I don't know if we have bad leaders. At least there is a lack of leadership and a clear understanding of the vision, the way we have to deal with the media. Having said that now, the added value, and I think it's a very important point that you are making, is the way you look at reality and your own society. Not only the elite and the establishment, is to be able to open up, which is missing in all the Western countries and even in the Muslim majority countries worldwide. This is a reality. Now, there is also something which is our presence, or should reflect our presence in the West, has to do with the ethical dimension. So you were talking about a lack of equity. There is something which is racism. It's just, at the end of the day, it's not ethical. There is something which is not acceptable. How should the Muslims deal with this? Because the opposite side would be, we need to promote more the Muslims and we need to promote ourselves, which is also the wrong thing to do. So which type of ethical added value you are expecting from Muslims in the field of media today, because this is missing?
Well, I mean, I don't expect all Muslims to be the same and have the same opinions. I'm not, kind of recommending a one-party system where we all get on the TV and say all the same things. The Muslim community is very diverse. But I would like to see prominent Muslims in our media who are reflective of the community. I don't feel they are. And I feel that, in a way, that the mainstream is picking these people out and making stars of them, in a way, because they're saying the right things. They're saying what they want to hear. I mean, the Quilliam Foundation is a big example of this. You know, an organization with no grassroots support whatsoever, whose voice has been artificially amplified by government finances in the past. And they appear on the BBC all the time, they appear on the mainstream media all the time, and literally Muslims are divorced from their rhetoric completely. They don't like this group, yet they keep on appearing as Muslim spokesmen all the time. And really that induces a suspicion in the minds of Muslims. Why are they appearing time and time again? Is it because journalists are lazy? Is it because journalists have an agenda here? It's extremely suspicious. Either you get the very extreme Muslims on mainstream British TV, people like Anjem Choudhury, who kind of scare non-Muslims, or you get the very apologetic Muslims who will say everything that the establishment wants to say, but you don't get the plethora of voices that at the grassroots exists, but you just get these two extremes on mainstream media. And I think that really the mainstream has to do something about that.
Thank you so much. I think that what is important in what you are saying is to look at the reality, and you said it from the beginning. We have to be very cautious with not generalizing. There are journalists doing their best, but still the situation is quite bad when it comes to covering Islam in the West, covering Islam here in Britain, and we can see this with the two stories that we had at the beginning of this program. Now, it's also important not to play the victims and to try to be assertive, and you said proactive, and in the mainstream. And this is where we need journalists that are able not only to talk as Muslims about Muslims and Islam, but coming with another perception of reality. And you said something which is very important. It is not for the establishment, not from the establishment, but the real life, ordinary people, the voiceless, even to be the voice for the voiceless in this country in an ethical way, because this is also something which is important. And also to understand, because you said something which is important, it's connected also to the government, and the people who are appearing are chosen because there is an agenda here, and it's important to have a leadership understanding that a new voice, an assertive voice, it's important in this country, here in Britain, but also around the West. Well, that's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows you have seen, and here is the way to contact us.
We at Islam in Life would like to hear your views about the subjects that we discuss. We would also love to hear your suggestions for our program, so get in touch with us. You can share your thoughts with other Islam in Life fans, engage in debate, and find out how to watch our previous shows. Follow us on Twitter at Islam and Life TV, or join us on Facebook by liking our page, Islam and Life on Press TV.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Rashan Muhammad Saleh. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope to see you next week, inshallah.